Okay, we can probably get started now. So hello everyone again, and welcome to our webinar today, as you can see, on children's rights in mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. My name is Carla. I work as a project manager in the area of social sustainability and integrity at the UN Global Compact Network UK, and I will be moderating this session. Now, before I introduce our guest speakers for the day, I just wanted to let you all know that if attendees, you're having any technical difficulties, you can let me know about that through the chat box, which should be at the bottom of your screens. And I will do my best to help. And if for some reasons you're having issues with the audio, you can also join by phone through the dial-in details we sent you today. In addition to the chat box, which should be on your screens, this webinar also features a Q&A box. So as attendees, you will not be able to unmute yourselves. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to send them in through the Q&A box at any time. And then we will take some of those questions at the end of the webinar. So as you may have seen from our reminder emails, we have 4 great guest speakers today. So before we dive into their presentations, let me just briefly introduce everyone. So on the line today, we have Joanna Rea and Maria Pia Bianchetti from UNICEF UK. We've got Elaine Mitchel-Hill from Marshalls and Abi Griffiths-Price from 2050. Now, Jo is the director of Advocacy at UNICEF. She will deliver an introduction to UNICEF UK for any attendees who may wish to know more about the organization's work. Maria Pia also works at UNICEF UK as the private sector policy and influencing manager, and she will deliver a presentation about preventing corporate abuses and realizing children's rights. Elaine is the Business and Human Rights Director at Marshalls PLC, a UK network member company which specializes in the manufacturing of hard landscaping and natural stone. And Elaine is also a member of UK Networks Advisory Group. And Abi is a senior consultant at 2050, also a UK network member company, and they specialize in helping different organizations turn corporate responsibility commitments into practice. And this includes human rights due diligence, responsible sourcing, women's empowerment, and other initiatives. This is our agenda for today. So after a brief overview of the UN Global Compact Network UK and UNICEF UK, we will continue with Maria Pia's presentation and Elaine and Abi's case studies. And finally, in the last 20 minutes of the event, our panelists will answer any questions you may have for them related to the topics at hand. So please feel free to send your questions through the Q&A box. So I'm aware that some of you may be unfamiliar with the UN Global Compact and the UK network. So let me just take a brief moment to introduce everyone to us. The UK network is a part of the UN Global Compact, which is the world's largest responsible business initiative. We connect companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable growth. There are over 12,500 companies around the globe that have signed up to the UN Global Compact, and to join, it takes a CEO commitment to operationalize our 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And then after making this commitment, companies have to report annually on progress against these areas and support the wider UN development agenda. We at the UK network offer a range of engagement opportunities to help companies fulfill these commitments. And we hope that if your organization is not already a member, you will consider doing so going forward. You can check out more about our work on the link that I will shortly post into the chat box, so just now. And finally, given that 2021 is the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour, we think that this year will be a particularly important one for the UN Global Compact community to have conversations like the one we will be having today. But without further ado, we will now go over to Jo for a brief overview of UNICEF UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to those who are joining us for today's discussion. And just to extend our thank you to the UN Global Compact UK Network for co-hosting the event with us today. Really great to be together having this conversation. Just very briefly, I'd like to take a few minutes just to introduce UNICEF and UNICEF UK, a little bit about who we are, give you a bit of an outline about why we work on business and children's rights, and then just talk a little bit about our advocacy agenda on children's rights in business at the moment. So firstly, for those who don't know UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, 75 years old this year, is mandated by the UN General Assembly to uphold the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and to promote the rights and well-being of children all around the world. We operate with our partners in about 190 countries and territories around the world, and have a specific role in providing advice and assistance to governments on all issues related to children's rights. So that's the whole way from education, health, nutrition, to things like corporate responsibility, access to services, ensuring that children's rights are respected the whole way through their life cycle. UNICEF UK here in the UK is one of 33 national committees that operate around the world, and we raise funds here in the UK to support UNICEF's work around the world. And we also deliver programs here in the UK, reaching about 2.5 million children every year through our partnerships with the NHS, with our work with about 5,000 schools across the country, and our work with local authorities. And as part of our mandate, we also advocate for children's rights. And again, that's here in the UK and around the world. We seek to influence decision makers, such as the government, the private sector, and those beyond, to ensure that children's rights are protected, children's rights are promoted, and they're upheld. And we also seek to amplify the voices of children and young people to speak for themselves on the issues that affect their lives. And we work directly advising the devolved administrations on trying to encourage them to incorporate the UN Convention in their own laws, policies, practices, and procedures. So in terms of why we work on children's rights specifically in business, as part of our broad mandate to ensure that children's rights are respected, we recognise that the private sector has a huge role to play in terms of their practice, their operations, their supply chains. So similar to our advocacy work that's directed at governments, we advocate for changes in legislation and policies that create the operating and enabling environments that support businesses to protect and promote children's rights. Now, as we know, of course, UK businesses and their supply chains operate all around the world, and virtually all sectors have an impact on children's rights. And child labour is usually the issue that's most synonymous when people think of children's rights in business, but we know that it goes much more, it's much broader than that, goes far beyond that one issue. And there's multiple ways that businesses have an impact on children's rights. And we know that there are many challenges, such as poor working conditions. Now, more recently, the risks associated in the online world related to excessive data collection, issues that might have an impact on children's privacy, expose them to issues such as cyberbullying. And then, of course, businesses have a huge role to play in terms of their impact on the environment. And if there's one issue that will have an impact on children's rights and their futures, it will be climate change, and whether we tackle climate change now. And of course, alongside those challenges, we know that businesses have a hugely positive impact on children's lives and their families, and have a huge role to play in protecting and promoting children's rights. And that's why it's a core agenda for UNICEF globally, but also for UNICEF UK. In terms of our advocacy focus at the moment, one of the big areas of our work is on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And Maria Pia, who's the co-author of the flagship report that we published, we'll talk you through that in a lot more detail and talk you through the research and its recommendations. But if I may, I just make 3 broad points. I think firstly, it's just to recognise that there is companies taking action to address the impact that they have on children's rights and on the environment, but it's a voluntary approach. And a voluntary approach is not going to get us to where we need to be. Businesses also need a level playing field, one that enables them to proactively seek out risk, that helps them develop innovative solutions to the problems that we see, but also helps them develop holistic and preventative solutions and to take that in their approach. And secondly, while we know that businesses are accountable for the impact of their activities, we know that's recognised in the UN guiding principles and in other frameworks, the ultimate responsibility for ensuring that rights, both human rights and children's rights, are respected lies with governments, it lies with national authorities. And that's why we think it's critical that the UK has legislation. And doing that will create this, enabling legislative and policy environment that really drives and supports businesses to respect children's rights and the environment. And given that UK businesses operate so globally, of course, we would see that change both in the UK and around the world. And finally, as Carla's already mentioned, this year is just a really big year for this agenda. It's the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour, and of course the UK is hosting a major summit on climate change at the end of the year, COP26. And the business sector has a critical role to play in addressing both of these issues. So this year creates a really good opportunity and a focus for us to think about what can an ambitious agenda be for both the UK government and for the business sector to really bring forward comprehensive legislation on what we think is a core issue on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. So I'll leave it there, Carla. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. And as I said, my colleague Maria Pia will get into the detail of our research to tell you a little bit more about our findings. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jo. Let me just share my screen for Maria Pia's presentation. And Maria Pia, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Thanks, Carla, for the introduction and Jo for the introduction to our work. As Jo mentioned, at the end of last year, we published this report, which is called Preventing Corporate Abuses and Realising Child Rights. And in this report, we made the case on why we think UK needs legislation mandating human rights and environmental due diligence, and why we think what our key recommendation is coming out of this report and our research. If you can go to the next slide, Carla, please. So our key recommendation here is what we are recommending is that the UK government introduces a new legislation that requires businesses to take preventative action and that by conducting holistic human rights and environmental due diligence, and that also allow access to justice for victims. And what we mean by that is that we feel that there is a need to have a comprehensive and holistic approach to human rights and environmental due diligence, which means having a requirement for businesses and an acknowledgement that there are some groups or some communities, such as children, that can be impacted in a different way by businesses, and they are at a heightened risk of being vulnerable or marginalized because of the activities of children. So next slide, please. So what we mean by having a comprehensive and holistic approach on human rights and environmental due diligence, what we mean is that we know that businesses have a multitude of impacts on children's rights, but we think that the only way this legislation would be effective is to have this holistic approach. And by that, it means that it is necessary that children's rights are a consideration of this legislation and the implementation by company of conducting human rights and environmental due diligence. But also we see that there needs to be a holistic approach in looking at the environmental side and the social side of due diligence. And I'll just go with few examples that comes from our research that explain a bit more in detail why we think there needs to be this holistic approach. For example, last year, the ILO and UNICEF has published research saying that warning about the increased risk of child labor as a result of the pandemic. And that is because the disruption in supply chains, the halt in manufacturing, has created a loss in household income, and this coupled with school closure might mean that children are pushed into exploitative ways of labor. We also know, for example, from some research that we conducted in Bangladesh, is that climate change is one of the reasons why children are pushed into child labor. And this is because children have been found to work to support their families who have lost everything in floods, or they have migrated because of floods. At the same time, we also know that climate change threatens agricultural stability, which means that the agri-food sector has also increasingly used pesticides. But children, because of their bodies still under development, are more vulnerable to pesticides, because their breathing rate is double to the one of adults. They inhale the double amount of pesticides, and exposure to pesticides has an impact on their health, and they might lead to death in case of acute pesticide poisoning. And then obviously we know that some projects by companies have an impact on environment. So for example, if we think about the mining sector, we know that dust, erosion, contamination of soil and water might happen as an environmental impact. And that means for children that are more vulnerable to these localized environmental impacts, because, for example, again, because of their still in the physical developments, might be more prone, more vulnerable to pollutants, because they play more outside, and that because of their hand-to-mouth behavior, again, they might be more prone, more likely to ingest pollutants. So all of this gave us a picture of the fact that it is necessary that children's rights are considered when we're talking about this legislation and its implementation by companies, and that also that we bridge the link, we make a much stronger link between environmental impacts and social impacts, and we see the things holistically. Next slides, please. So as part of the research that we've done, we found that human rights and environmental due diligence is a way for businesses to respect human rights, which includes children's rights and the environment as well. And this is because as a framework, human rights due diligence helps businesses prevent and mitigate these adverse impacts on people and the planet, because it requires them to take a proactive approach to preventing abuses, because it requires them to identify, to assess the risk, and therefore them to take action and communicate about it. And preventative action is essential to ensure respect for children's rights, as Jo has mentioned. Now, human rights and environmental due diligence is a system, is a process, but it needs to lead to an outcome, so which is prevention and mitigation of negative impacts, because what we do not want is a tick box exercise. And as one of the supporting measures that usually are recognized as part of human rights and environmental due diligence is remediation is also key, both for the obligation of states to protect children's rights, but also for companies' responsibility to respect children's rights. And we know that for children, it's particularly difficult to access justice when it comes to the violation of their rights. However, every child has an inherent right to effective remedy when these violations of their rights occur. But we know that there is a number of reasons why children face barriers for accessing justice, which might be that remedial mechanisms sometimes are not designed for children and for their in consideration of their evolving capacities. And also we know that, for example, children might lack information. They might have to rely on adults for information to support emotionally, logistically, and financially as well. So access to justice is another key element of a framework that would help preventing abuses and realizing children's rights. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the reason why we're calling for legislation is there are a number of reasons that we identified in this piece of this report on why we need legislation. And one of them is, as Jo mentioned, is that voluntary approaches do not bring the scale of impact at the speed required to bring changes to the lives of children. We know that there are companies that are leading the way. We know that that there are companies that are holding the responsibility to respect human rights, children's rights, and the environment, but there are still a lot that they are not. And so we need a system that scales up and accelerates this action by companies, and legislation will do that by creating a requirement for all businesses to undertake human rights and environmental due diligence. We also need to level the playing field, in recognition of the fact that there are companies that are indeed upholding the responsibility to human rights. There needs to be a system that actually does not penalize those companies for upholding the responsibilities, but also creates a disadvantage for other companies to not uphold these responsibilities. And therefore, a legislation would create a level playing field among companies, and also would create clarity among businesses about what is expected, what is the standard of conduct expected by businesses. But also, if we consider that similar legislation has been adopted or is under discussion in other jurisdictions, it is a way also to support UK businesses in managing the risk across their value chain and supply chains, but also to be prepared to meet standards in other countries. Also, something not to forget is that we see an increasing concerns and expectations for consumers, including children, about interest in business behavior. There are an increasing number of children and young people that are speaking up and expecting businesses to respect the rights of people, but also the environment. And the two last reasons why we think this legislation is necessary is to bring coherence to the policy and legislative framework in the UK, but also for the UK to respect its obligations towards children's rights. There is a growing recognition among regional and international bodies working on human rights that requiring businesses to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence is a way to close a gap in human rights protection and to implement their obligation when it comes to the role of the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Pia. That was very comprehensive. And I'm sure that we'll have some time to follow up later on some of the points you mentioned in the Q&A. And I would like to encourage our participants to also put in any questions for Joe or Maria Pia in the Q&A box. But for now, let's go over to Elaine. So for her case study about Marshall's work in this space and the journey they've had. So Elaine, ready whenever you are.
Thank you very much. So for those of you that don't know Marshall's PLC, we're UK's leading construction products and materials company. And we, of course, as part of that, source a great deal of natural stone wherein our highest risk lies. So I'm going to speak to you today specifically about the work that we've done in India, because essentially that's where our journey started back in 2005. And in preparing for today's session, it's kind of forced me to think about our evolution or our journey from 2005 to now. And actually it made me reflect on what enormous leaps and changes have occurred since 2005, even though I'm in full agreement with Joanna and Maria Pia in terms of what needs to come next. I've kind of I want to give you a sense, kind of sketch out for you what that journey has looked like, bring us right up to date and look at the impact of COVID in relation to our activity around children's rights, and share with you probably 5 key challenges that we face or are reoccurring challenges or constant challenges, in the hope that that inspires some great discussion in the Q&A session. So I think if I think about our first kind of tranche of work, if I was looking for the words, and it feels like our naive period, if you will. So by that, I'm perhaps being a little bit harsh on ourselves, and I don't mean that we weren't trying hard enough or we weren't thinking hard enough, but looking back now, it's almost as if we were thinking too small in 2005, say 2005 to 2008. the language that we have now in terms of human rights just was not available to us then. And in fact, many companies who had what they would refer to as human rights issues would certainly not be speaking out, and would be perhaps pilloried in the media for doing so. So there wasn't even a comfort in talking like we're talking about these issues today, which is in itself a big leap forward. So I would say that our work in that period focused upon what now feel more like CSR programs or initiatives on the ground. Certainly also the implementation of the ETI base code within our supply chain, so working with our suppliers in terms of supplier engagement, the streamlining of our supply base so that we were able to engage with suppliers on those issues that were important to us, that actually at the time were probably not as important to them. So I think we used our financial leverage with our supply base, our streamlined supply base at that point, to get some buy-in to help us to begin this journey, or to get some traction on this journey. And we were also most definitely shining a light upon the issues of child labour in the stone sector in Rajasthan, both with our domestic and commercial customer base. So I think that's, in some respects now looking back, that was where we started, and it feels now that that we were thinking kind of way too small, but I think we were working with what we'd got at the time. So I think in terms of the next period, which I'm almost seeing this like kind of stratas of stone, you know, kind of digging kind of from the bottom up, I would say was more of our adolescent period. So I think that, you know, there was work underway on the Ruggie framework, and all the thinking that went with that. There was work on UNICEF's UNICEF Save the Children and UNGC's Children's Rights and Business Principles. We were part of the piloting of that, and also undertook some work looking at our own operations in relation to that framework, which was really very challenging for us at the time. But to begin to bring into focus what we'd seen out in the field in terms of, you know, children working in the stone sector, and then pulling back and looking at the bigger picture, if you like, an aerial view of our impacts as a business on children as a whole. So that was definitely a kind of a wake-up point for us. So yeah, I think that adolescent waking up period where we really begun to grapple with some of the bigger issues. I think probably from 2015 onwards, I would say, is where we've got more full vision, kind of like an adult period, if you will, where we are coming to more fully understand the complexities that are often kind of almost coming into focus and then going out of focus as we're grasping with them, and the context is changing, or not least our understanding of those issues is developing. So perhaps what we thought we were doing that was great maybe is not so great. So grappling with those issues in a kind of a more thoughtful way, I guess. Working more solidly with Indian partners on the ground, working with UK government, with embassies, and I guess fully understanding the wide range of actors that are required in order to bring about the systemic change. So if I think back to those kind of early, that naive period, you know, we were working within our supply chain, which of course we have to do. I think all of us in the private sector absolutely have to do a piece of work there, but that's never going to be enough. Because we are, you know, if the context doesn't change or the system doesn't change, we're forever going to be policing that supply chain, which is just simply not satisfactory, and nor does it begin to contribute to any of the issues. So that more adult period, if you like, and I think that you know, together with developments in terms of legislation. You know, if I think back to 2008 and the kind of trajectory of legislation, both in the UK and overseas, have all been incredibly helpful to me as somebody who's working on human rights from inside of business. I think all of those things for me bring us up to date in terms of a pandemic period, if you will, where we've got it's almost like, you know, as horrendous as the pandemic has been, for me, it's presented just a real window of opportunity where I feel like people's thinking is different, their ears are open, that board are very receptive to allowing all of the issues that we've been working on since 2005 to be pulled out, kind of more fully explored, enhanced in terms of what we're doing. And I do see this as a real opportunity to not only reposition what we mean by sustainability for our internal and external kind of stakeholders, but also begin to explore what for us better futures for everyone would look like in terms of how we interrelate, or how we touch different people as a private sector organisation. So absolute increasing scrutiny and increasing mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence is all part of sharpening our focus. In terms of the impact of COVID in relation to children's rights, I think it's actually forced me to think about our messaging around children's rights. So to sharpen that up and to simply say no to child labour and yes to children's rights, and to go hard and strong with that message. Yes, we all know there are complexities within that, but if we're saying no to child labour, then anybody within our organisation, for example, can remember that and can frame that in terms of the decisions that they're making, whether it's procurement or whether it's sales or whatever part of our business it is. We've got certainly an increased focus on our systems and procedures and re-looking at those in the wake of the pandemic, or in whatever part of the journey in relation to the pandemic we're on. We definitely have looked and are continuing to look at how we use technology. So yes, as part of our auditing system, how we can improve that, but also how we can do live monitoring on the ground, the mapping of our supply chain coordinates against global data through Traffic Analysis Hub on modern slavery and trafficking, and also the mapping of transport and goods transportation against modern slavery and human trafficking routes. So again, kind of looking at different contexts within our supply chain in terms of how children are impacted within that. We've, I think, a revision of our approach in terms of what human rights information we absorb, how we triangulate that data from multiple sources, and how we interpret that, and who we get to help us interpret that, again, to challenge us as an organisation to do better. We're undertaking at the moment, we've got an independent review of, again, using the Children's Rights and Business Principles framework, both in the UK, in India, in Vietnam. So having that independent view of what we're doing, and also most importantly, a real internal push. So, I think I've realised over time that as much as interventions on the ground or at any level, absolutely need commitment from the top. So our CE, for example, is speaking out in support of children's rights specifically at 2 events in June. And that sends a clear message to our business in terms of where children's rights are on our agenda. So just very quickly, challenges for us, and I'm not going to speak too much around all of these, perhaps we'll pick them up in Q&A. We've got internal and kind of internal dynamic tension, I would describe it as, particularly with in the procurement function in relation to the decent work agenda and children's rights. That's like, I don't know, balancing a board on top of a football and then trying to stand up. It's a constant challenge. I think government to business engagement in terms of modern slavery implementation on the ground overseas, especially thinking about the recent review of overseas aid from a UK perspective, and the recommendation for government to align that, an element of that in some way, with private sector activity overseas. The formalisation of an informal sector, where we fit in, what we do, We're working hard to be a supporter and a facilitator, but also recognise that the Indian actors have probably the biggest part to play in that. Obviously, well, the nexus between human rights and environment is very much kind of risen up the agenda for us. And still, actually, as Joanna mentioned, still the lack of a level playing field for those businesses who actually are trying very hard or are making inroads in support of children's rights. And there is no differential at the moment between those who are working really hard and those who are doing nothing. So those are some of the ongoing challenges.
Thank you, Elaine. Very comprehensive. So I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to follow up on some of the points from your presentations in the Q&A. And again, if anyone has any questions for Elaine about Marshall's work on this issue, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And now, last but not least, we'll go over to Abi for her presentation. Abi, whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Carla. It's a real pleasure to be with you today to talk about this important topic. I actually only joined 2050 2.5 weeks ago, so I'm brand new to the organisation. But the good news is that 2050 is not brand new to child rights. Over the years, the organisation, they've worked on various projects, including human rights impact assessments, integrating a child rights lens. They developed a training course for UNICEF titled Doing Business with Respect for Children. And there's also been a lot of work around corporate clients' child labour strategies and approaches. Today, I want to share with you 2 business examples, but first, I just want to touch on why human rights due diligence might not be working at the moment for child rights. Children are, of course, humans, and as set out in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights due diligence covers all human rights. However, that doesn't mean that we can assume that children's rights will be adequately addressed through human rights due diligence. So looking at the human rights due diligence process then, as depicted in the diagram here, and first starting with the identify phase. Human rights impact assessments, which don't consider children as specific stakeholders or rights holders, could identify all potential and actual human rights impacts, but don't necessarily take into consideration how these impacts are experienced differently by children than by adults. From a rights perspective, children are in many ways unique, as Maria Pia mentioned. They're still developing physically, emotionally, and mentally, and so they will experience impacts differently. For example, an impact assessment might identify pollution as a not particularly severe impact on adults, whereas that same pollution could be really, really harmful for children's health. Also, it's worth commenting here that children don't enjoy the same agency as adults. They need a lot more support, protection, advocacy, and care, and to enable them to take their right role in community life. And it's also worth pointing out as well that in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, actually children have additional rights that they are entitled to, above and beyond the ones that we commonly think about in human rights due diligence. So moving on in the due diligence process to look at respond, mitigation methods that companies might use to address impacts may not be adequate for children where they are adequate for adults. For example, just a simple example in agriculture, personal protective equipment used by adults might be sufficient for their protection, but it might not protect children, and this could be because it's either too big or it's the wrong shape. So this needs to be considered. In terms of grievance mechanisms, they need to be tailored for use by children. I think children would be a lot less likely to pick up the phone to talk to a stranger about their concerns than adults might be. So grievance mechanisms could be kind of integrated into the kinds of channels that children would use, things like youth clubs or health centres or even schools, so that children can raise their issues. I guess, yeah, the real key message is that children need to be included as stakeholders in their own right. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, my business examples are just going to focus on human rights impact assessments. And the first one is Barrick Gold, the Canadian mining company. 2050 worked with Barrick Gold in 2014 as part of an industry-wide pilot commissioned by UNICEF, looking at how to integrate children's rights into human rights due diligence in the mining sector. And as part of this pilot, Barrick Gold implemented an impact assessment at its operations in Peru. 2050 reviewed Barrick Gold's impact assessment methodology and at relevant places inserted children's rights considerations into it. And in order to help Barrick with the challenge that they faced of how to look at how children experience impacts differently compared to adults, 2050 provided them with a child vulnerability matrix. Now, this matrix outlined a number of vulnerabilities that children might face throughout childhood, from when they're in the womb through to teenage years. And what this matrix did was gave Barrick essentially a really much better understanding of how children might experience impacts differently, and therefore how they could tailor their response in accordance. What the additional child lens in this impact assessment also did, and through the types of questions around child rights that we used with stakeholders in conversations, Barrick was unable to identify where it could have a positive impact on children in areas which weren't even necessarily related to the mine. For example, they could help address child road safety out in the communities. At the end of this impact assessment, Barrick decided that they would adopt the changes that 2050 had made to their assessment methodology and also the child vulnerability matrix into future impact assessments. Next slide, please. So my second business example is Kuoni, the global tourism company who 2050 worked with in 2012 on a human rights impact assessment in Kenya. At the time, Kuoni was doing quite a lot of work with UNICEF, as UNICEF was developing some children's rights and business tools. And therefore, Kuoni was really keen to look at children as a distinct group of stakeholders in this impact assessment. 2050 was responsible for ensuring the methodology was sufficient to do this, and made sure that questions were included around child rights, and in particular looking at the issue of child sex tourism. During the impact assessment, children were interviewed and they were asked questions about the daily impact of tourism on them and their families and their communities, with questions ranging from, do you come across tourists in your everyday life, to, are there anything that you're afraid about with regards to your own personal safety? Child sex workers were consulted in the form of a focus group, and this was designed to understand the causal factors of how they ended up in this type of work, what the tourism industry and the government were seen to be doing about it in their opinion, and what actually would be really meaningful action to address this issue. Also, to adult stakeholders, questions around children's rights were asked by integrating UNICEF's child rights checklist indicators, and this helped also get a better sense of impacts on children. So some of the challenges that Kuoni faced at the time were the complexity with consulting with children, This obviously entails a lot more issues around safeguarding and protection of children. So co-organised and 2050 worked with an NGO on the ground who was really experienced in this, and they worked with a social worker who was able to advise on the best approach and the best kind of language to use with the children. There was also the challenge of maintaining a really broad view on child rights when the issue of child sex tourism had been identified as such a key issue from the outset of the impact assessment. In fact, a CSR advisor from UNICEF at the time recommended that in future impact assessments, co-organised first looked at the broad range of rights before deciding what was material. And this was just to ensure that no impacts were missed during the assessment process. However, co-organised gained really valuable insights through the impact assessment. In particular, they learned a lot about the causal factors for child sex tourism, from the contextual issues such as economic marginalisation due to factors which were sadly actually taking place in certain parts of the tourist sector in Kenya. But it also provided opportunities for co-organised operating partner to take a lead on this issue and to influence and to work with the government and other actors to address it. Because co-organised was so, took such a lead with seeing children as a distinct group of stakeholders and incorporating them into their impact assessment, they were really seen as leading the way in child rights in the tourist sector at the time. Next slide, please. Okay, and just really quickly, I know we're running a little bit behind. I just want to end with a tiny bit of food for thought called the Child's Fire. And essentially what this is that hundreds of years ago, the elders of Indigenous communities, whenever they met, they lit a fire to remind them of the first law, which is that no law, no decision, no action will be permitted to go out from their council that would harm the children. The Child's Fire is a pledge to the welfare of children, born and unborn, but more profoundly, it's a pledge to life and for each generation to preserve the regenerative capacity of the earth. The really simple principle that if all organisations, including companies, would follow, would really help ensure true sustainability, securing ours, our children's futures, both individually and collectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abi. And that concludes our presentations for the day. So we can now go into a panel discussion and a Q&A. So we have had a few questions come through from our attendees, and I think we can probably start with Sarah's question. So Sarah is saying that previous attempts at mandatory human rights due diligence have been criticized for being toothless. So can you talk a little bit more about what it's required to give legislation more teeth, I suppose, especially on child rights. So happy for Joe and Maria Pia to start, and then we can also go to Elaine and Abi afterwards.
Hi, Carla, I can take this one. So in our report, we highlight what will be key elements of this legislation in the UK to make it really effective. And we recognize, and the analysis that we've done, it was based on looking at what has not been working so far and what could make it actually work. So few key elements to give a bit of teeth to this legislation that we have recognized is, for example, having a meaningful disclosure requirement, so you can allow for peer learning, for scrutiny, but at the same time there needs to be an enforcement mechanism for this if this disclosure requirement is not respected. But also the other element that we think it should be necessary in any mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence is the access to justice piece. So ensuring that when abuses occur, victims actually can access justice and obtain effective remedies for the abuse of their rights.
Great, thank you, Maria Pia. Happy for anyone else to take this question, if you'd like. maybe Elaine and Abi can provide us with a little more insight from the business on this issue.
Yeah, so I'm all in favour of the mandatory human rights due diligence, and we've made that kind of very plain as an organisation in kind of assisting in the push towards that. For us, it builds upon certainly some of the existing legislation. So I think about the modern slavery legislation in the UK, but also voluntary initiatives such as the Truestone one, which is kind of from a Dutch sorry, it's from the Netherlands perspective. So there is a specific initiative which is voluntary, but starts to move in the direction. I think the direction of travel is good, but I think that to have mandatory reporting in is absolutely has to be the way forward from our perspective. And some people do say that the Modern Slavery Act has had no teeth, and I think we can look at it on one end of the spectrum to the other. I think what it's done for those organisations who are engaged is it's provided the push and the platform to begin that work. But I think absolutely, I'm totally in favour of mandatory due diligence.
Great, thank you, Elaine. Abi, would you like to offer any comment?
Sure, and this is my personal perspective. I agree. I have long been of the opinion that mandatory due diligence legislation is needed to kind of move the needle. From what I have seen, I think the Modern Slavery Act was a really good start in the UK, but because the law is just around, you have to put out some kind of statement, and that statement can say that a company has actually done nothing on modern slavery. For me, I don't think that goes far enough. So yes, there needs to be kind of mandatory reporting, but also I think there should be something that entails that companies have to do due diligence to understand what their risks and their impacts are. Yeah, to make it really have teeth, as it were.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I suppose one related question also comes from Monique. So Monique is asking, to which extent do you see a role model in the existing legislation focusing on child labour due diligence from the Netherlands? So just to give everyone a little bit of background on what Monique is referring to. So in 2019, in the Netherlands, a law was passed that applies to all companies registered in the Netherlands that sell or deliver goods or services to Dutch customers, and also companies that are registered abroad but sell or deliver goods or services to Dutch customers. And what this law requires those companies is to submit a disclosure statement declaring that there are adequate due diligence measures in place to prevent their products or services from being produced in a way that involves child labor. And these statements are then made publicly available to any customers by the state authority. Maybe we can go over again to Maria Pia and Joe to so maybe, do you have any comments on this? Would this be a way forward for the UK as well?
I'll admit that I am not familiar with the content, with the exact content of the due diligence law in the child labour due diligence law in the Netherlands. I think, while child labour obviously is an incredibly important issue, I think again what would be important is taking again these holistic approach and not looking only at one issue as well. What we would want is like something broader that looks at all the different impacts. Obviously, it can be a first step looking at this issue, but what we would think is like what we think it is better is a much broader approach that looks at all the various impacts and then prioritize depending on the severity of these impacts.
Great, thank you, Maria Pia. Anyone else would like to chip in? And if not, we can go to another. Yeah, Abi, go ahead.
Make a quick comment. Yeah, I think, you know, what I personally am seeing is that, you know, you have Modern Slavery Act in the UK and something similar in Australia, and then you have the child labour one coming out from the Netherlands. And I think what I really like about UNICEF's proposal here is that it would be mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, but starting out with a specific child lens. So it really, as Maria Pia says, will cover all range of rights, and because child rights are integrated from the beginning, that means that they wouldn't have to be retrofitted at a later date. So I think your approach is really to be applauded.
Great, thank you very much, Abi. And maybe we can now go over to Simon's question. So Elaine, I know that you've already shared the link to the Children's Rights and Business Principles in the chat, but basically what Simon is asking, could you share some more details on the independent review you did using this framework of the Children's Rights and Business Principles, or maybe provide a link where our attendees could find more information about that?
Sure. Well, I've posted the link to UNICEF's page for regarding Children's Rights and Business Principles framework. Our review, the independent review of our own operations and supply chains is complete, but we get the full report at the end of this month. So it's likely that we will publish that report. So I can certainly circulate a link when that's up. I don't know what will, obviously I've no idea what will come back as a result of that. We shall see, but the framework for us takes us to look at, kind of business operations, our supply chain activities, makes us think broadly in terms of women's empowerment principles and where they butt up to the children's rights piece. I mean, it might be more appropriate for Maria Pia or Joanna to speak about the details behind CRBP, considering that it's a kind of their piece of work, if you like, together with Save the Children. So yeah, I don't know if that's more appropriate.
Yeah, happy for you, Maria Pia or Joe, to add any comments to what Elaine has already mentioned.
I mean, the child rights and business principles were developed by UNICEF, the UN Global Compact, and Save the Children. And what they offer is a child rights lens to the UNGP. So essentially, are a very useful framework to highlight what are the responsibility of companies, first and foremost, in various areas, but then also what could companies do in order to support children's rights.
Great, thank you very much, Maria Pia. And we are just a minute away from finishing up this webinar, so I think we'll have to stop there. Thank you all very much for sending in your questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to answer all of them, but I think that's always the case when we have a really engaged audience. So apologies about that, and thank you for everyone who has been participating, whether by sending in questions or asking for relevant information for their own businesses. So yeah, thank you first and foremost to all of our panelists for participating and delivering your presentations. And thank you all very much for tuning in. And I hope you've enjoyed the event. We'll share the recording of this webinar and a few relevant links with you in due course. But in the meantime, I hope you have a lovely day and a lovely rest of the week. Thank you very much.